They told her the smell would be the worst part, that the Alpha King's body had been rotting for 20 years, flesh splitting and knitting itself back together in an endless, agonizing cycle that left his skin swollen and weeping a thick, yellowish liquid no healer could explain. They said grown men had vomited at the threshold of his chamber, that servants drew lots to determine who would tend him, and the losers wept. So when the guards pushed open the heavy oak doors and gestured Maria inside, she had already pressed a cloth soaked in lavender oil against her nose, her fingers white-knuckled around the fabric, her stomach braced for the assault. But the smell never came. Maria stood in the doorway of the Alpha King's private chamber, the lavender cloth hovering uselessly at her face, and breathed in nothing but cool air tinged with cedar and old stone. The room was dim, heavy curtains drawn against the afternoon sun, and in the center of it, propped against a mountain of pillows on a bed that could have held 6 men, lay Azrael. He was not what she expected. The rumors had painted a monster, a creature more corpse than man, something to be pitied and feared in equal measure. And yes, his body bore the evidence of his affliction. His arms, exposed above the blankets, were swollen and mottled, the skin splitting in thin fissures that oozed a slow, clear liquid, before sealing shut and splitting again somewhere else. It was as if his body were at war with itself, destroying and rebuilding in a cycle that never rested. But his face was still sharp, still proud, dark eyes that burned with an intelligence the sickness hadn't touched, a jaw that clenched against pain he refused to voice. He looked like a man who had been fighting for 20 years and had simply refused to lose. Those dark eyes found her now, narrowing with suspicion. "Who are you?" His voice was low, rough at the edges, but carried the unmistakable weight of command. Even rotting, even bedridden, this was a king. Maria opened her mouth to answer, but the bitterness she'd carried for 3 days, across miles of road and through the gates of a court she despised, rose up before she could stop it. "I'm the woman your court purchased," she said coldly, "the one your brother bartered for with half a kingdom, because apparently a dying king cannot die without a pretty face to look at." Azrael's expression shifted. Not anger. Something worse. Confusion, then hurt, flickering across features that were clearly unaccustomed to showing either. "My brother did what?" Before Maria could answer, the chamber door swung open and a younger man strode in. Dan. She recognized him from the announcement, the same dark hair as the king, the same proud bearing, but unmarked by sickness, his face tight with barely contained emotion. He looked between Maria and his brother, and his expression crumbled. "Azrael," Dan began carefully, "I can explain." "You offered half my kingdom," Azrael said, his voice dangerously quiet, "to bring a stranger to my deathbed?" "It was your wish," Dan's voice cracked. "When we were boys, you said if you ever died, you wanted to die looking at something beautiful. I was just trying to— I was 12 years old, on Dan." Silence crashed through the room. Maria watched the king's face, watched the anger drain from it, and leave behind something raw and exhausted. He looked at his brother the way you look at someone you love too much to stay angry with, someone whose devotion has become its own kind of wound. "Send her home," Azrael said quietly. "I didn't ask for this, and I won't have someone forced to watch me die." But Maria didn't move, because in that single exchange, something had shifted inside her. She had walked into this room expecting a selfish, dying tyrant clinging to comfort at the expense of others. Instead, she had found a man embarrassed by his own brother's love, a king whose first instinct was to send her away, rather than accept a sacrifice he hadn't requested. And standing in the doorway, Dan, with tears he was trying very hard not to shed, looking at his brother like the world was ending and he couldn't stop it. Maria lowered the lavender cloth from her face. She wouldn't need it. She wasn't sure she'd need any of the armor she'd brought with her. But the fury she carried, the betrayal that had driven her here, that she would keep. Because the man who had sent her to this place deserved every ounce of it, 6 days earlier, Maria had been happy. Not the reckless, blazing kind of happiness that announces itself, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes from being useful. From knowing that when someone in the Greymore pack had a problem, they came to her. She was not a healer, not a tracker, not a warrior. She held no formal title, occupied no seat on the council. But Maria had something none of them had, a mind that remembered everything. Photographic memory, the old healer had called it when Maria was a child, watching the girl flip through a book of herbal remedies once, and then recite it back, word for word, 3 days later. Whatever Maria paid attention to, truly paid attention to, it stayed. Not just the words on a page, but the way the ink sat on the paper, the crease in the corner, the faint watermark beneath the text. She consumed knowledge the way other wolves consumed meat, hungrily, instinctively, as if her mind were a living thing that would starve without it. And she used every scrap of it for them. When the pack's crops failed 2 summers ago, it was Maria who remembered a passage from an agricultural text she'd read at 14, a technique for rotating root vegetables that had saved a village in the Southern Territories. When the blacksmith's son broke his arm in 3 places, and the healer couldn't set it properly, it was Maria who recalled the bone-setting diagrams from a medical manuscript she'd studied years before, guiding the healer's hands with a precision that left even him shaking his head in disbelief. When trade disputes arose with neighboring packs, Maria could recite the exact terms of agreements signed before she was born, because she'd once glanced at the documents in the council archive. She was the person everyone needed, but no one knew how to title. And Brutus had seen that. He had seen it before anyone else, or at least that was what Maria had believed. He had courted her with a ferocity that had taken her breath away. Brutus was the pack's alpha, broad-shouldered and commanding, with a voice that could silence a room and a smile that could light one up. He had pursued Maria with the kind of single-minded devotion that made the other women in the pack whisper with envy. Gifts left at her door. Long walks through the forest where he'd ask her questions about everything, hanging on her answers as if they were sacred. He told her she was extraordinary. Told her he'd never met anyone like her. He told her he couldn't imagine leading the pack without her beside him. Maria had mistaken it for love. She understood now, with the clarity that only betrayal could bring, that Brutus had never loved her. He had loved what she could do for him. Every problem she solved, every crisis she navigated, every piece of knowledge she pulled from that extraordinary memory, it reflected on him. Made him look capable. Made him look wise. Made the pack believe their alpha had chosen well. He paraded her at gatherings, introduced her to visiting alphas with a pride that she now recognized as ownership. "This is my mate, Maria. She can do anything." Not, "She is everything." She can do. The distinction haunted her now. But 6 days ago, Maria hadn't seen it yet. 6 days ago, she had been sitting in their home, reading a text on mineral compounds by firelight, her mother dozing in the chair beside her. Her mother, Aline, was old now, her joints stiff, her hearing fading, but her mind still sharp enough to scold Maria for reading too close to the flames. Aline had no sickness, just the honest weight of years pressing down on a body that had worked hard its whole life. Maria cared for her without complaint, adjusting blankets, preparing soft foods for teeth that weren't what they used to be, reading aloud on nights when Aline's eyes were too tired. It was a quiet life, a good life. Then Brutus had come home with fire in his eyes. "Have you heard about the Alpha King?" he asked, pacing the length of their small home with an energy that made Maria uneasy. She had heard. Everyone had heard. Alpha King Azrael of the Grey Crown Court had been suffering from a rotting sickness for 20 years. Maria had been 15 when the first reports reached their pack, whispered accounts of a young king whose body had begun to decay, while he still lived. His flesh rotted and healed simultaneously, splitting open to weep a thick, slimy liquid before knitting itself shut, only to rupture again elsewhere. The cycle never stopped. His body remained perpetually swollen, perpetually breaking, perpetually rebuilding. No healer in any territory had been able to explain it, let alone cure it. Azrael was 55 now, which meant he had endured this horror for most of his adult life. And recently, his younger brother Dan had made an announcement that had rippled through every pack in the region. Dan had offered half of the king's kingdom, lands, titles, wealth beyond imagination, to any daughter or mate willing to come to court and spend the Alpha King's final days with him. The offer should have been irresistible. Half a kingdom was the kind of fortune that changed bloodlines forever. But no one had accepted. The reason was simple. Azrael was an alpha, and alphas didn't die easily. Not even sick ones. His body had been rotting for 2 decades, and he was still alive, still breathing, still enduring. No one knew when he would finally die. It could be months. It could be years. It could be another 20 years of watching flesh split and reform, of living with the stench and the horror and the slow, grinding misery of a body at war with itself. The promise of half a kingdom meant nothing if the king refused to die. No father would sacrifice his daughter to that uncertainty. No Matt would volunteer for an open-ended sentence of suffering. But Brutus was of a different mind entirely. Think about it, Maria. He stopped pacing, turning to face her with eyes that gleamed in the firelight. Half the kingdom. Do you understand what that means? The lands alone would make us the most powerful pack in the region. We'd have wealth, influence, a seat at the royal court. Everything we've ever wanted. Maria set down her book carefully. Everything you've ever wanted? She corrected. Brutus waved her words away like smoke. You're missing the point. Everyone else is too afraid to take the offer because they think the king will linger. But they don't have what I have. He pointed at her, and the gesture made something cold settle in Maria's stomach. They don't have you. She stared at him. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you go to the king's court. You tend to him. You do what you always do, you figure things out, you solve problems, you make it work. His voice was bright, encouraging, the same tone he used when presenting her to visiting dignitaries. You've never failed, Maria. Not once. You're the most capable person I've ever known. The praise landed like a slap, because now she heard it for what it was. Not admiration, but calculation. Not love, but leverage. Every other alpha in this region, Maria said slowly, is protecting their own, their daughters, their mates. They are choosing their people over wealth, and you... She looked at him with an expression she had never directed at him before. Disgust. Pure, unfiltered disgust. You are ready to sell me for a kingdom. Brutus had the nerve to look wounded. It's not selling, Maria. It's an opportunity. And it's not just about us. Think about the pack. They adore you. When you come back, when we have that wealth... If I come back. You will. You always come through. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to that intimate register he used when he wanted something. I believe in you, Maria. I always have. She turned away from him, staring into the fire. No. The word hung between them. Brutus was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something hard and deliberate. Your mother is comfortable here, isn't she? He said. This warm room, the soft bed I provided, the food, the fire. He paused, letting the implication settle. The attic is cold this time of year, Maria. Drafty. No place for an old woman with stiff joints. Maria's blood went cold. She turned to face him, and whatever he saw in her expression made him take half a step back before he caught himself. You wouldn't, she breathed. I don't want to, Brutus said, and he had the audacity to sound sincere. I'm asking you to see the bigger picture, for us, for the pack, for your mother. He reached for her hand, and Maria let him take it only because her fingers had gone numb. I'll take perfect care of her while you're gone, I promise. Maria looked down at his hand wrapped around hers. The hand that had held hers during their mating ceremony. The hand that had brushed the hair from her face on their first night together. The hand that was now squeezing just a fraction too hard. A reminder of who held the power. She had never felt so disgusted by another person in her entire life. But her mother was sleeping in the next room. Her mother, who trusted Brutus, who called him son, who had no idea her comfort, her safety, her warmth depended on Maria's obedience. "Fine," Maria said. The word tasted like ash. "I'll go." Brutus smiled. It was the smile of a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted, and it made Maria's skin crawl. But he wasn't finished. "One more thing," he said, pulling her closer, dropping his voice so low she had to lean in to hear. "Don't try to help him." Maria frowned. "What?" "The king. Don't look for a cure. Don't try to fix whatever's wrong with him. That's not what this is about." His eyes were steady, calculating. "What we need is for the king to die so we can collect what was promised. If anything, find a way to speed things along." The words landed like a physical blow. Maria pulled her hand free and stepped back, staring at the man she had called mate, the man she had given her heart to, and saw a stranger. No. Worse than a stranger. A monster wearing a familiar face. "I'll go to the king's court," Maria said, her voice flat and empty. "But don't ever touch me again." Brutus smiled as if she hadn't spoken. "I knew you'd understand." The following morning, Brutus called the pack together. He stood before them in the meeting hall, shoulders squared, chin high, the picture of a proud alpha making a noble announcement. "Maria has volunteered to answer Prince Dan's call," he declared, his voice ringing through the hall. "She will travel to the Grey Crown Court and tend to Alpha King Azrael in his final days." The silence that followed was sharp. Maria stood beside him, rigid, her face revealing nothing. She could feel the pack's eyes on her, could read their expressions without trying. Shock, concern, admiration, because they knew her. They knew what she was capable of, and if anyone could endure the horror of the rotting king's court, it was Maria. "No one could do it better," someone murmured from the crowd, and the agreement rippled through the room. They didn't know. None of them knew she was there because she'd been threatened, because her mate had bartered her like livestock and held her mother's safety over her head like a blade. They saw a volunteer, a hero, the woman who always came through. Then Brutus delivered his final blow. "To ensure Maria can perform her duties without distraction," he said, his tone measured and rehearsed. "I will be releasing our mate bond." Maria flinched. She couldn't help it. The words hit her like a fist to the sternum. Releasing the mate bond, he said it so casually, as if he were discussing trade routes or patrol schedules, as if the sacred connection between mates was just another inconvenience to be managed. "It's temporary, of course," Brutus added, placing a hand on her shoulder. The weight of it felt like a chain. "When Maria returns, we'll reclaim the bond. This is simply to allow her to focus fully on her duty." The pack murmured their understanding. Of course. How practical. How selfless of their alpha. Maria said nothing. She felt the bond sever like a thread being cut, clean and final, and waited for the grief to come. But all she felt was a vast, cold emptiness, and beneath it, buried so deep she almost missed it. Relief. She left that afternoon. Her mother had cried, clutching Maria's hands with fingers that trembled from age and fear. "Come back to me," Aline had whispered. "Promise me." "I promise, Mama," Maria had said, and meant it with everything she had. She didn't look at Brutus as she left. She didn't look back at all. The journey to the Grey Crown Court took 3 days by horse, and Maria spent every mile of it nursing a fury so deep it frightened her. Not just at Brutus, now at the crown, at Prince Dan and his grotesque offer, dangling wealth like bait to lure women to his brother's deathbed, at a world that treated women as currency, as comfort, as something to be spent in service of men's wishes. By the time the spires of the Grey Crown Court rose against the horizon, pale stone towers reaching toward a steel-gray sky, Maria's bitterness had hardened into something sharp and permanent. She would not be soft here. She would not be kind. She had been sold by her mate and bought by a prince, and she would treat this arrangement with exactly the contempt it deserved. Prince Dan met her at the gates. He was younger than she'd expected, with dark hair that curled at his temples and eyes that held a weariness too deep for his years. He bowed his head as she dismounted, a gesture of genuine respect that Maria refused to acknowledge. "Thank you for coming," Dan said quietly. "You don't know what this means to—" "Where is the king?" Maria interrupted. "I'd like to get this over with." Something flickered across Dan's face. Hurt, maybe, or recognition of a pain that mirrored his own. But he said nothing, simply gestured for her to follow. They walked through corridors of gray stone and cold light, past servants who averted their eyes, past guards who stood like statues. The palace was beautiful in the way a mausoleum was beautiful, grand and hollow and suffused with grief. And at the end of a long, silent hallway, they stopped before a pair of heavy oak doors. Dan's hand hesitated on the handle. Maria braced herself, pressing the lavender cloth to her nose, untightening every muscle against the horror she was about to face. The doors opened, and the smell that everyone had warned her about, the stench that made grown men retch and servants weep, never came. The king told her to leave. Maria didn't. She stood at the foot of Azrael's bed in the silence that followed Dan's fractured explanation. Dan's hands were clenched at his sides, and Azrael, propped against his pillows with his body weeping that slow, clear liquid, looked at his younger brother with no anger at all, only exhaustion. "I told you I didn't need this," Azrael said quietly. "You told me when we were 12 that you wanted to die looking at something beautiful," Dan replied, his voice cracking. "I remembered every stupid thing you ever said because I thought you were running out of time to say them." Maria watched the king close his eyes. When he opened them again, the hurt had been folded away behind the composed mask of a man who had spent 20 years pretending his body wasn't consuming itself. "Send her home, Dan. I won't have someone forced to sit vigil over a dying man for a reward. That's not who we are." It was the word "we" that stopped Maria. Not I, we. As if Azrael would rather suffer alone than let his family's name be stained by the desperation of his brother's love. Maria thought of Brutus, who had sold her without flinching. Then she looked at Dan, who had offered half a kingdom not for greed, but because he couldn't bear to watch his brother die without trying. "I'll stay," Maria said. Both brothers turned to her. Dan's eyes went wide. Azrael's narrowed. "You don't have to," the king said carefully. "Whatever was promised to you." "I'm not staying for the promise," Maria interrupted. She knew, with a certainty that settled in her chest like a stone, that she could not walk away from this room. Not from a dying king who refused comfort. Not from a brother whose love had driven him to something foolish and beautiful. Not when the man who had sent her here wanted her to let the king die. "I'm staying because I choose to," she said. Azrael studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, a small, tired gesture. "As you wish." And that was that. The first week was the hardest. Not because of the sickness, though that was difficult enough to witness. The rotting cycle was relentless. Maria would sit beside Azrael's bed and watch his skin split along his forearms, thin fissures opening like cracks in dry earth, weeping that strange, clear fluid before slowly, painfully sealing shut. Hours later, it would happen again somewhere else. His shoulders, his chest, the back of his hands. But it didn't smell. That was the thing Maria couldn't stop thinking about. Every healer's report described a stench so overpowering it could empty a room. Yet sitting inches from the king's splitting skin, Maria detected nothing beyond the faint cedar scent of the wood paneling and the clean mineral smell of his salve. It didn't make sense. Decay produced odor. That was biology, chemistry, an immutable fact. If his flesh was truly rotting, the smell should have been inescapable, unless it wasn't rotting at all. The thought lodged itself in Maria's mind like a splinter, and her memory, that relentless photographic engine, began to turn. She recalled a passage from a text on elemental afflictions she'd read 6 years ago. The author had described conditions that mimicked decay without producing the bacterial markers of true decomposition. Healing cycles trapped in infinite loops. Damage and repair that looked like rot but wasn't. She filed the thought away. Not yet. She wasn't ready yet. At the hardest part of that first week was the king himself. Azrael was proud, fiercely so, and he bore his affliction with a dignity that bordered on stubbornness. He refused to let Maria help him sit up, refused to let her bring his meals, refused to talk about his condition at all. "You don't have to sit there," he told her on the third day, when she'd settled into the chair beside his bed with a stack of books from the palace library. "I'm sure there are better ways to spend your time than watching a man's skin fall apart." "Probably," Maria agreed, "but I've already read everything interesting in the East Wing, so you're my entertainment now." Azrael stared at her. Then, for the first time since she'd arrived, the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. She learned him slowly. Not through questions, because Azrael deflected those with practiced ease. She learned him through observation. He read late into the night. He preferred his tea without sweetener, but accepted honey when he thought no one was watching. He tracked the sun's movement across his chamber, and his expression when the light touched his face was the closest thing to peace she'd seen from him. And he asked about his people. Every servant who entered, every guard who changed shift, Azrael inquired after them by name. He cared about them. Genuinely, deeply, without performance. "Why haven't you abdicated?" Maria asked him one afternoon. They had fallen into a cautious rhythm by then, not quite companionship but something adjacent to it. "Dan has refused the throne," Azrael said simply. "Every time I've offered, he refuses. He says the crown is mine until I no longer draw breath." He smiled, and the warmth in it transformed his face. "My brother is the most stubborn man alive. He'd rather serve a dying king than rule a living kingdom." Maria thought about that for a long time after Azrael drifted into sleep. She found Dan in the west corridor that evening, standing by a window overlooking the gardens. The last light caught his profile, and she noticed for the first time how tired he looked. The bone-deep fatigue of years spent watching someone you love disappear. "Why did you do it?" she asked without preamble. Dan turned, his expression guarded, braced for her anger. "Why did you make the offer? The real reason." For a long moment, Dan said nothing. Then something behind his eyes gave way, and the words came out in a rush that told Maria he'd been carrying them alone for a very long time. "Our mother died when I was 7, he said. "Our father was not a kind man. He believed strength was forged through suffering." Dan's voice was steady, practiced, as if he'd rehearsed this speech in the dark. "Azrael was 12. But every time our father raised his hand to me, Azrael stepped in front of it." Maria's chest tightened. Every beating meant for me he took. He broke his arm twice before he turned 15, both times shielding me. Dan's hand found the window ledge, gripping it as if the stone could anchor him. "And when he became king, he didn't stop. He protected me from the court, from political enemies, from every threat. He gave me a life that should have been stolen from me. And he paid for it with his own." He turned to face her fully, and his eyes were wet. 20 years I've watched him rot. I've watched him suffer in silence because he doesn't want anyone to worry. I've brought every healer, every physician, every herbalist who would come, and none of them could help. His voice broke. "So yes, I made a desperate, stupid offer because I would give anything, everything, every piece of this kingdom, to see my brother whole again." The corridor was quiet. Maria stood very still, letting Dan's words settle into her memory, or they would stay forever, and felt the last of her bitterness toward him dissolve like salt in warm water. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for how I've treated you." "You had every right," Dan said. "You did it out of love. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it real." She paused. "I know what it looks like when someone uses people for selfish gain. This isn't that. Something shifted between them. Not dramatic, not electric, just a quiet recognition. Dan looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Not as the angry woman who'd stormed into his brother's chamber. Not as a tool or an asset. Just Maria. And the way his gaze lingered, warm and wondering, was so entirely different from the way Brutus had ever looked at her that it made her breath catch. "I want to try something," Maria said, "with the king's condition. I'm not a healer, but something about his sickness doesn't add up." Dan's expression shifted to a fragile, desperate hope. "Maria, every healer in 3 kingdoms has tried. Every solution is born out of a problem," Maria said. "Well, the right person just hasn't looked at it yet." She began the next morning. Azrael watched with tired amusement as Maria set up a workspace in the corner of his chamber, commandeering a table that had previously held decorative vases and replacing them with glass vials, a mortar and pestle, strips of clean linen, and a set of the court healer's instruments she'd borrowed without quite asking permission. "You're aware that the finest medical minds in the known world have examined me," Azrael said dryly. "I am," Maria replied, carefully collecting a sample of the clear fluid from a fresh fissure on his forearm. She held it up to the window light, studying the viscosity, the faint iridescence that caught the sun. "But the finest medical minds were looking for rot. I'm not." Azrael raised an eyebrow. "What are you looking for?" "I'll tell you when I find it." She paused, lowering the vial. "But I'll need your court healer. I'm not trained in medicine, and there are procedures I'll need guidance on. Sample preparations, reagent handling, things a healer would know by instinct." Azrael nodded and sent for him. Aldrich arrived within the hour, a tall, gaunt man with silver-streaked hair, pulled back from a sharp face and hands that moved with the precise economy of someone who had spent 40 years practicing his craft. He took one look at Maria's makeshift workspace, at the vials and the mortar, and the borrowed instruments, and his expression curdled like spoiled milk. "What is this?" Aldrich asked, not bothering to hide his disdain. "This is Maria," Azrael said from his bed, his voice carrying that quiet authority that made even dismissive men straighten. "She's going to study my condition, and you're going to help her." Aldrich turned to the king, incredulity written across every line of his face. "Your Majesty, I have served this court for 3 decades. I have consulted with the foremost physicians across 5 kingdoms on your affliction. And now you'd have me assist a girl with no medical training who set up shop with borrowed tools on a flower table." "Yes," Azrael said simply. "That's exactly what I'd have you do. Your Majesty, there is no harm in trying, Aldrich." The king's tone softened, but the command beneath it remained. "Every method you've used has failed. Every healer I've seen has failed. If this woman wants to look at my sickness from a different angle, the least we can do is let her try. And the least you can do is help." Aldrich's jaw tightened. He looked at Maria the way one might look at a child who'd wandered into a war room and demanded to see the battle plans. But he bowed his head. "As you wish, Your Majesty." He did help, grudgingly, precisely, and with a running commentary of disapproval that Maria learned to filter out the way you filter out the drone of cicadas on a summer night. When she asked him to prepare a reagent solution, he did it flawlessly while muttering that she wouldn't know what to do with the results. When she asked him to show her how to section a skin sample, he demonstrated with surgical precision, while informing her that it had taken him 7 years to master the technique she was attempting to learn in an afternoon. Maria didn't argue with him. She simply watched his hands, memorized every movement, and replicated it perfectly the next time. The speed with which she absorbed his knowledge only seemed to irritate him further. She threw herself into the work with a ferocity that surprised even her. Each day she collected samples, fresh fluid, dead skin from the edges of healing wounds, traces of salve. She studied them with every tool available, mixing compounds, testing reactions, consulting the palace's extensive medical library, and committing entire volumes to memory in single sittings. Her photographic memory devoured texts on elemental pathology, autoimmune disorders, regenerative anomalies, magical afflictions documented across centuries. She failed. Again and again, she failed. Her first theory collapsed when the fluid samples showed no magical residue. Her second fell apart when she couldn't identify any parasitic organism. Her third, fourth, fifth attempts each ended the same way, promising leads that crumbled under scrutiny. And with each failure, Aldrich was there. "As I predicted," he said after her first theory disintegrated, arms folded, watching her scrap 3 days of careful work. "You're chasing shadows. A healer would have known that pathway was a dead end before wasting a week on it." After her third failure, he grew bolder. "This is what happens when you let sentiment drive medicine," he told Dan, who had been sitting quietly beside Maria, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "She has passion, I'll grant her that. But passion without training is just noise. The king's condition requires expertise, not enthusiasm." Maria said nothing. She cleared her workspace, organized her notes, and started again. She had heard men like Aldrich her entire life, men who believed knowledge belonged only to those who'd earned it through their approved channels, who couldn't fathom that someone might arrive at understanding through a different door. She didn't need his approval. She needed his hands and his instruments and his reluctant expertise, and she had all three. But Maria did not give up. She had never given up on anything in her life, and she was not going to start with a king who deserved better than the slow death his body was giving him. Dan was beside her through all of it. He appeared each morning with tea she hadn't asked for, sat with her while she worked, handed her instruments when her hands were full, and listened without interruption as she thought aloud, us talking through her theories in rapid, tangled sentences that would have lost anyone else. But Dan kept up. He asked questions that were sharp and relevant, not because he understood the science, but because he understood her. Understood that talking through the problem was how she solved it, and he admired her. But his admiration was nothing like Brutus's. Brutus had admired her the way a man admires a fine weapon, for its utility, for what it could do for him. Dan admired her the way you admire a sunrise, with quiet wonder and no desire to own it. In her quiet moments, usually late at night when the palace slept, Maria thought about the two brothers, about Azrael, who had taken beatings meant for Dan and carried a kingdom on rotting shoulders without complaint, about Dan, who refused a throne because accepting it would mean admitting his brother was gone. Two men who would give anything to save each other. The thought warmed something inside her that had been cold for a very long time. Their chemistry grew in the margins, in the brush of Dan's fingers when he passed her a vial, in the way his laugh, rare and startled, made her heart kick. In the evenings they spent walking the palace gardens, their shoulders close enough to touch but never quite touching. He understood she had a mate, or had had one. Maria had told him the bare facts, that Brutus had sent her here under threat, that the bond had been severed. Dan had listened without judgment. "He doesn't deserve you," Dan had said quietly. "No," Maria agreed. "He doesn't." She had already made up her mind. She would never return to Brutus as his mate. But she wasn't ready to open another door. Not until she'd finished what she came here to do. 2 months in, on a night when rain hammered the palace windows, Maria found it. She had been cross-referencing a passage from a 300-year-old text on regenerative curses with a modern treatise on inflammatory cascades when the connection blazed through her mind like lightning. She sat bolt upright, scattering papers, her eyes wide. The fluid, the clear fluid that wept from Azrael's wounds. It wasn't a symptom of decay. It was the cure. His body had been producing the answer for 20 years, and every healer who'd examined him had wiped it away like waste. The sickness wasn't rot. It was regeneration gone haywire. A healing cycle trapped in an infinite loop because a single compound was missing from the king's system. The fluid was incomplete. It needed a catalyst, a mineral base that would stabilize the regeneration and allow the cycle to complete. Maria's photographic memory supplied the answer before she'd finished forming the question. Page 214 of a geological survey she'd read at the age of 17. a mineral compound found in the volcanic springs of the eastern mountains. She could see the page in her mind, every word, every diagram, the coffee stain in the upper left corner. She knew how to save the king. Maria stood so fast her chair toppled backward. Azrael stirred but didn't wake. She needed to tell Dan, now, tonight, before doubt crept in. She found him in his study, bent over correspondence by candlelight. He looked up when she burst through the door. "What's wrong? Is Azrael—" "I found it!" Maria gasped, her hands shaking. "Dan, I found the cure!" Dan stared at her, his expression cycling through disbelief, then confusion, and then slowly, like dawn breaking over a dark landscape, hope. "You're certain?" "I'm certain." Dan crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. The embrace was fierce, desperate, his face buried against her hair. Maria felt his tears hot against her neck and held him tighter. "Thank you," he breathed. "Thank you, Maria." She closed her eyes and held him, and felt something settle inside her chest. Not the frantic, grasping need Brutus had called love. Something quieter. Something that felt like coming home. But she pulled back gently, meeting his eyes. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I still have to make it work." The mineral arrived from the eastern mountains on the back of a rider who had nearly killed his horse getting there and back in 4 days. Maria held the sealed pouch in both hands, feeling the weight of it, the rough texture of the volcanic powder through the leather, and for one terrifying moment allowed herself to consider the possibility that she was wrong, that her theory was beautiful and logical and completely, devastatingly incorrect, that she would mix this compound into the king's fluid and nothing would happen, and Aldrich would fold his arms and say, as I predicted, and Azrael would continue to rot, and Dan's hope would shatter, and it would be her fault. Then she set the doubt aside, the way she'd been setting doubt aside her entire life, and got to work. The preparation took 3 days. Maria worked in near silence, measuring the mineral compound with a precision that made Aldrich watch despite himself. She ground it to a fine powder using the mortar and pestle, mixed it with a base of the clear fluid she'd been collecting from Azrael's wounds for weeks, and heated the mixture over a low flame until it thickened into a pale, iridescent paste. Her photographic memory guided every step, recalling ratios from the geological survey, temperatures from the medical texts, binding techniques from the healer's own demonstrations that she'd memorized without him knowing. Aldrich stood in his usual corner, arms folded. He had been quieter since Maria's announcement. Not supportive, never that, but quieter. As if some reluctant part of him wanted to see what would happen. "If this fails," he said on the 2nd day of preparation, "and it will, the compound could accelerate the cycle. His body could tear itself apart faster than it heals." "I know," Maria said without looking up. "You're willing to risk the king's life on a theory built by someone with no medical training, no formal education, no—" "Aldrich." Dan's voice came from the doorway, quiet but absolute. "Enough." The healer pressed his lips together and said nothing more. On the evening of the 3rd day, the cure was ready. Maria carried the small clay pot to Azrael's bedside, where Dan already sat, his hands clasped between his knees, his face tight with the kind of hope that hurts worse than despair. Azrael was propped against his pillows, watching Maria with those dark, intelligent eyes that had seen 20 years of healers approach his bed with promises and leave with apologies. "You don't have to explain what it does," Azrael said. "I trust you." The words nearly undid her. 3 simple words from a king who had no reason to trust anyone, who had been poked and prodded and examined and failed by every expert his kingdom could produce. He trusted her, not because of credentials or titles or training, because he had watched her refuse to quit. Maria sat on the edge of his bed and dipped a clean cloth into the paste. "This might sting," she said. "Everything stings," Azrael replied with the ghost of a smile. "I've had 20 years of stinging. Do your worst." She applied the paste directly to the freshest fissure on his forearm, a long, weeping split that had opened just an hour ago. The effect was almost immediate. Azrael hissed through his teeth, his jaw clenching, the muscles in his arm going rigid. The paste sank into the wound, the iridescent sheen of it disappearing into his flesh. And for one horrible moment the fissure widened, the skin pulling apart further, the fluid pouring out faster than Maria had ever seen. Dan shot to his feet. "Maria!" "Wait," she said, her voice steady even though her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her temples. "Wait." And then it happened. The edges of the fissure shivered. Not the usual slow, painful knitting she'd watched for 2 months, the skin grudgingly pulling itself together only to split again elsewhere. This was different. The skin sealed smoothly, cleanly, like a zipper closing. The swelling around the wound deflated. The angry redness faded to pink, then to the warm brown of healthy skin. And it stayed closed. Silence filled the chamber. Maria, Dan, even Aldrich, all of them staring at the patch of perfect, unblemished skin on the king's forearm. Azrael lifted his arm slowly, turning it in the candlelight, staring at flesh that hadn't been whole in 2 decades. "By the gods!" Aldrich breathed. He stepped forward, professional instinct overriding his pride, and took the king's arm in his hands, pressing gently along the healed skin. His fingers were trembling. "There's no inflammation, no fluid. The tissue is fully regenerated." He looked at Maria, and for the first time there was no disdain in his expression, only shock. "How did you know?" Maria didn't answer. She was watching Dan, who had sunk back into his chair and was pressing both hands over his mouth, his shoulders shaking, tears streaming silently down his face. He wasn't looking at his brother's healed arm. He was looking at Maria as if she had reached into the sky and pulled down the sun. The full treatment took 2 weeks. Maria applied the paste to every fissure as it appeared, and each time the result was the same. The wound sealed, the swelling retreated, the skin healed clean and whole. After the first week, new fissures stopped forming entirely. Azrael's body, freed from the endless loop of damage and repair, began to recover with the fierce vitality of an alpha who had been fighting for 20 years and finally had permission to win. Color returned to his face. The swelling that had distorted his features receded, revealing the sharp, proud bone structure beneath. He sat up on his own. He stood. He walked to the window for the first time in years and stood in the sunlight with his eyes closed and his hands open at his sides. And Maria had to look away because the expression on his face was too private, too sacred for anyone else to witness. Aldrich, to his credit, never claimed any part of the cure. When the court physicians gathered to examine the king's recovery and demanded to know how it had been achieved, the old healer stood beside Maria and said, "She saw what none of us could see. The fluid wasn't waste. It was the body's attempt at a cure. She simply completed what the king's own system had been trying to do for 20 years. He paused, then added stiffly, "I was wrong about her." It was the closest thing to an apology Maria would ever receive from him, and she accepted it with a nod. 1 month after the first application, Azrael stood before his court in full health. He was magnificent. Without the sickness distorting his body, the Alpha King was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, his face carrying the lines of suffering, but also the unmistakable light of a man who had been given back his life. The court erupted. Nobles who had whispered about succession and decline now cheered and wept. Servants who had drawn lots to avoid his chamber now fought for the honor of attending him. Azrael raised his hand for silence. When it came, he spoke with a voice that no longer rasped or strained, but rang through the great hall with the full power of an Alpha King restored. "For 20 years this kingdom has endured alongside me. You have served a king who could barely sit up in his own bed, who could not walk among you, who could not lead as you deserved. Your loyalty during those years is a debt I can never repay." He paused, and his gaze found Dan in the crowd. But the man who held this kingdom together during my illness was not me. It was my brother. Dan shook his head, but Azrael continued. I have tried many times to give Dan this crown. He has refused every time, out of loyalty, out of stubbornness, out of love. But I am no longer dying, and I am no longer the king this realm needs. Azrael removed the heavy silver crown from his head and held it before him. I am retiring. The throne passes to my brother, Prince Dan, who has earned it 1,000 times over. The hall erupted again. Dan stood frozen, his face pale, his mouth open, looking at his brother with an expression that held every emotion a person could feel at once. Azrael walked to him, placed the crown in his hands, and pulled him into an embrace that made the entire court fall silent. Take it, Azrael murmured. You've carried the weight of it for 20 years. Now carry the title. Dan's hands closed around the crown. He looked at his brother, then at Maria, who stood to the side watching with tears she didn't bother to hide. And slowly he nodded. The celebration lasted 3 days. But on the first evening, while the court drank and danced and marveled at their king's recovery, Dan found Maria in the garden. The same garden where they'd walked in those quiet evenings during his brother's illness, shoulders close but never touching. The moon hung low and heavy over the palace walls, casting silver light across the rose beds. Maria, Dan said, and the way he spoke her name made her stop walking. It was the voice of a man who had been holding something back for a very long time and couldn't hold it anymore. She turned to face him. He stood in the moonlight with the crown he hadn't yet worn, holding it at his side like an afterthought, because the thing he valued most in this moment wasn't a kingdom. It was her. I love you, Dan said. I've loved you since the night you told me you'd found the cure and your hands were shaking and your eyes were on fire. I've loved you since you refused to leave my brother's room. I've loved you since you stood in that corridor and told me that what I did was wrong but real. Maria's heart was pounding. She wanted to step forward, to close the distance, to tell him that she loved him too, that she'd known it for weeks, maybe longer, maybe since the first time he'd looked at her and seen a person instead of a tool. But she couldn't. Not yet. Give me time, she said softly. I need to put things in order first. Dan's expression shifted, a flicker of hurt quickly replaced by understanding. He nodded. I'll wait, however long you need. Maria left the Grey Crown Court the following morning. The ride back to Greymoor took 3 days, and she spent them in silence, not nursing bitterness this time, but gathering strength. She knew what waited for her, and she was ready. Brutus met her at the pack gates. His expression when he saw her approach, alone and unbowed, cycled through surprise, relief, and then, when he read her face, something close to fury. You saved him, Brutus said, his voice flat. I told you not to help the king. I told you to let him die, and you saved him. Yes, Maria said, I did. Do you have any idea what you've cost us? Brutus stepped closer, his alpha presence pushing against her, trying to make her submit the way it always had. Half a kingdom, Maria. We would have had half a kingdom if you'd just done what I asked. You didn't ask, Maria said, and her voice carried across the courtyard, where pack members had begun to gather, drawn by the tension. You threatened. You threatened to put my elderly mother in a cold attic if I didn't go. You broke our mate bond and sent me to watch a man die so you could profit from his death. The courtyard went silent. Maria could feel the pack's eyes on her, could see the shock spreading across face after face as her words landed. Brutus's expression darkened. That's not what happened, he growled. You told me not to help the king, Maria continued, her voice clear and unwavering. You told me to find a way to speed his death. You sent your mate to a dying man's bedside with instructions to hasten his end, not because you cared about me or about the king, but because you wanted wealth. She turned to face the gathered pack, the people who had believed she'd volunteered, who had admired her sacrifice, who had no idea the truth of what their alpha had done. He held my mother's safety over my head, Maria said. Told me he'd move her to the attic, an old woman with stiff joints and no one else to care for her. If I didn't agree, I didn't volunteer, I was coerced. The murmur that swept through the crowd was like wind before a storm. Maria saw her mother at the edge of the gathering, clutching a shawl around her thin shoulders, her weathered face crumbling as she understood what her daughter had endured in silence. Is this true? One of the council elders demanded, stepping forward. Brutus opened his mouth to deny it, but the elder wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Maria. Every word, Maria said. The elder turned to Brutus, and there was no uncertainty in her expression. You threatened a pack member's mother. You coerced your mate into a dangerous arrangement for personal gain. You broke a mate bond under false pretenses and instructed her to facilitate a king's death. She looked at the other council members who had gathered, and one by one they nodded. This is not the conduct of an alpha. You can't do this, Brutus snarled, his composure finally breaking. I am your alpha. I have led this pack for— You have led this pack with Maria's mind, the elder interrupted. Every crisis she solved, every problem she navigated, you took credit for her work and called it leadership. We see that now. She straightened. By unanimous decision of the council, you are removed as alpha of the Greymore pack, effective immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. Brutus stared at the elder, then at the pack, then at Maria. She watched the realization settle over him, watched his face cycle through rage, disbelief, and finally something she'd never seen from him before, fear. The fear of a man who had built his entire identity on someone else's brilliance, and now stood alone with nothing. Maria felt no satisfaction, no triumph. Only a clean, quiet finality, like closing a book she'd finished reading. Her mother reached her first, wrapping thin arms around her with a strength that belied her age. My girl, Aline whispered, crying into her shoulder. My brave, brilliant girl. The pack gathered around her then, not with pity, but with something fiercer. Respect, gratitude, recognition of what she had always been to them, and what she had endured in silence. They thanked her. They apologized. They promised her mother would never want for anything again. Maria stayed 3 days. She ensured her mother was settled into comfortable new quarters with 2 young women assigned to help her. She sat with the council and answered their questions about what had happened at the Grey Crown Court. She said goodbye to the people she had served her whole life, the people who had finally seen her clearly. And then she left. The ride back to the Grey Crown Court felt different from every journey she'd taken before. The first time, she'd traveled in bitterness and rage. The second, in quiet determination. This time, Maria rode with nothing weighing her down. No mate bond pulling at her chest. No threats hanging over her mother's head. No manipulation whispering in her ear. Just open road and open sky and the steady drumbeat of her own heart leading her forward. She arrived at sunset. The palace walls glowed amber in the fading light, and the guards at the gate recognized her immediately, bowing as she passed. By the time she'd dismounted in the courtyard, Dan was already there. He stood at the top of the palace steps, still not wearing the crown. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd run his hands through it, and his expression when he saw her was the most unguarded thing she'd ever witnessed on another person's face. Hope and terror and joy and restraint all warring behind his eyes. Maria climbed the steps. She stopped 1 step below him, close enough to see the rapid pulse at his throat, to catch the scent of him, cedar and warmth, to feel the pull of something that wasn't a mate bond but was just as powerful. I put things in order, she said. Dan's breath caught. And? Maria looked at this man who had offered half a kingdom out of love for his brother, who had sat beside her through every failed experiment without losing faith, who had admired her the way you admire a sunrise, with wonder and no desire to own it, who had told her he loved her, and then let her go because she needed to leave, and waited without knowing if she'd come back. Yes, she said. Dan blinked. Yes? Yes, I love you. Yes, I'm staying. Yes to everything. The sound Dan made wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. He reached for her, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that made her eyes sting, and Maria rose onto her toes and kissed him. The kiss was warm. That was what she noticed first. How warm he was. How alive. How different from the cold transactions and calculated touches she'd known before. His lips moved against hers softly, carefully, as if she were something precious he'd been given permission to hold. Then her hands found the back of his neck, pulling him closer, and the kiss deepened into something that tasted like the beginning of a story she actually wanted to live inside. When they finally pulled apart, the courtyard below them had filled with people. Palace staff, guards, courtiers, all watching. And at the edge of the crowd, leaning against a column with his arms crossed and the healthiest grin Maria had ever seen on his face, stood Azrael. He caught Maria's eye and nodded once. A small gesture from a king who had lost everything to his sickness and gained it back through the stubbornness of a woman who refused to stop looking for answers. Maria smiled back. Then she turned to Dan, laced her fingers through his, and walked with him through the palace doors. She had come here as a sacrifice. She was staying as a queen. If this story stayed with you, let me know in the comments. Would you have made the same choice Maria did? And if you want more stories where betrayal turns into power, subscribe and stay with me.